Today we're going to go over Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, Chapter 2 scenes. So we've already talked about scene changes before. And scene changes are going to be when Percy Jackson moves from one setting to a completely different setting, or one place to a completely different place. Sometimes scene changes can also happen when we're changing the time of day. So maybe Percy is in the daytime at first, and then it says later that evening, and it changes to the nighttime. So that's another type of scene change. Time matters also when we're looking at scene changes. The other problem I've noticed you guys have been having has been with conflict. So let's review conflict real quickly. So conflict in literature is the opposition of persons or forces that brings about the dramatic action central to the plot of the story. Conflict may be internal, as a psychological conflict within a character, or external. Examples of that are character versus character, character versus nature, or character versus society. So if I'm going to take that big definition and just make it really easy, conflict is the problem in the story. There are two categories of conflict: internal conflict and external conflict. For internal conflict, we have character versus self. For external conflict, we have character versus character, character versus nature, and character versus society. Now let's take a deeper look at internal conflict, character versus self. So let's look at our main character, Percy Jackson. If he's trying to make a decision, any sort of decision that's going to impact him, that would be character versus self, an internal conflict. If you've ever seen cartoons and you have an angel on the shoulder of a character and a devil on the other shoulder of the character, and they're trying to convince him or her to change their mind or make a decision, that would be a perfect example of character versus self. Now let's talk a little bit about conflict or external conflict. The first one we have is character versus character. Now, character versus character is when one character strongly disagrees with another character. And this disagreement can turn into a physical argument or fight, or it can also be a verbal argument or fight, where they're going against the same ideas. Now, in regards to external conflict, character versus nature, it's going to be when a character is physically going against nature. So they could have a storm and be running away or trying to survive a storm. Or maybe it's a tornado that they're trying to survive. Or maybe even it's a tsunami that they're trying to survive. But the thing is, they're trying to survive a natural disaster or physical element of Earth. So our last type of external conflict is going to be character versus society. It's a little harder to grasp. So maybe the character believes or thinks one thing, and his beliefs and his thoughts go against the world. Or they can even go against a town or a community. Or maybe he's going against a small group of people that believe exactly the opposite of him. He's going against a small society in his thoughts, beliefs, and sometimes even his actions reflect that. So for your chart, you're going to ask, what type of conflict is in this scene? What is the problem in this story? I even gave you a sentence stem. The sentence stem is, this is character versus blank because, and you will decide, is this character versus self? Does Percy have to make a decision? Is this character versus character? Is Percy having to fight someone or having a verbal argument with someone? Is this character versus nature? Is Percy trying to survive against a storm? Or is this character versus society? Is he going against the beliefs of a group of large people? Finally, there's the because part of the sentence stem. And you're going to tell me what you saw in the chapter that made you pick this type of conflict. So the first scene starts when Percy gets back from the museum, and it talks a lot about his internal thoughts. Right now, his internal thoughts are he's really confused that nobody recognizes or remembers Mrs. Dodds. He feels like frustrated by it. He knows Grover's lying, and his grades, they start to slip from D's to F's. The headmaster eventually, and this is the most important part, sends him a letter saying, "Hey, Percy, I'm sorry, but you're not coming back to Yancey Academy next year. You're being kicked out." And Percy is okay with this. He'd rather be at home with his mom. Now let's discuss Chapter 2, Scene 2. So in Chapter 2, Scene 2, Percy is really frustrated, and he's studying for this exam, because his Latin exam, because that's the only one that he cares to actually study for. And he makes a decision that he's going to go down and talk to Mr. Brunner, because he knows that Mr. Brunner wants him to do his absolute best. So he picks up his mythology book and he starts heading down the stairs to talk to Mr. Brunner. So let's begin Chapter 2, Scene 3. So when Percy gets downstairs to the faculty offices, he noticed that it's dark and it's empty, and all of a sudden he hears voices from Mr. Brunner and Grover talking in Mr. Brunner's office. And the quote is, "I dare you to try to not listen if you hear your best friend talking about you to an adult." So he's not a big eavesdropper, but in this case, he decides he's going to eavesdrop on Mr. Brunner and on Grover. So as he's listening to Mr. Brunner and Grover talk about stuff like kindly ones and mist, he drops his book and it hits the ground on the floor. Mr. Brunner and Grover immediately stop talking, and Percy scrambles to find a place to hide. Percy finds the nearest door and slips inside. The next thing he hears is some clop, 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 like muffled wood blocks, and then a sound like an animal snuffling right outside his door. Mr. Brunner says it's nothing, and his nerves are all messed up, and Grover says he could have sworn, and Mr. Brunner tells Grover to go back to his dorm. But the big thing that you need to take away from this is we never saw Mr. Brunner or Grover in person on this. Percy was hiding from the closet, and it was all sounds. Chapter 2, Scene 4 is really, really short, and it takes place back inside Percy's dorm room. So after Percy leaves the faculty area, he goes back upstairs to his dorm room, and he finds Grover lying on his bed studying his Latin notes like he'd been there all night. And Grover asks Percy if he's okay because he looks a little off. And Percy's not too happy with Grover right now, so he just tells him he's going to go to bed, and he was really frustrated that Grover and Mr. Brunner was talking about him behind his back. Moving on to Chapter 2, Scene 5. So the next afternoon, he's taking his 3-hour Latin exam, and he gets done, and Mr. Brunner calls him aside. And he was afraid at first, Percy was afraid, that Mr. Brunner knew that they'd been eavesdropping. But instead, Mr. Brunner tells Percy that it's okay that he's getting kicked out of Yancey Academy because he's not meant to be there. Percy's really hurt by what Mr. Brunner says, and he leaves the classroom feeling really frustrated. In Chapter 2, Scene 6, we're going to flash forward to the last day of term, or the last day of school. So they're packing everything up in their dorm room. And we have Percy, and he's listening to everybody else who is talking about their vacations and what they're going to do for the vacations. And the only person he was scared to say goodbye to at the time would have been Grover. So in Chapter 2, Scene 7, Percy and Grover are back on the bus. And while they're on the bus, Percy springs it on Grover and says, "Well, are you looking for the kindly ones?" Because Grover's acting a little jumpy. Grover is shocked that Percy realizes that they had a conversation about him. And he eventually hands Percy a card and says he has a summer home. He also tells Percy that he's supposed to protect Percy. And Percy's confused from this because Grover's been protected from bullies by Percy all year long. Eventually, the bus starts to smoke, and it smells like rotten eggs, and they pull over on the side of the road. In Chapter 2, Scene 8, the bus driver tells everybody to get off of the bus, and Percy and Grover get off the bus because the bus is smoking. Across the street, they see a fruit stand, and next to the fruit stand, they see 3 old ladies. The 3 old ladies are knitting a sock, a giant sock. And the lady in the middle looks at Percy and then takes scissors and snips a cord. This freaks out Percy and Grover, and they run back onside the bus as soon as the bus driver tells them that they can. The final scene of chapter 2 is scene 9. Percy and Grover are back on the bus, and they have just broken out in a really cold sweat from seeing the old ladies. They are both still freaking out over seeing them, and the fact that they snipped the cord. Percy asks, "They're not like Miss Dodds, are they?" Grover asks Percy, "Are you sure you saw her snip the cord?" And then starts mumbling about how always 6th grade, they never get past 6th grade. This really concerns Percy. And he asks, "Is someone going to die?" And that's the end of scene 9 for chapter 2.